Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Crop and Forage Production Week. This is our last day of the week, and if you're here yesterday and the day before, we discussed some of the crop-related topics in the last 2 days. But today we're going to focus completely on forage production, and we have two speakers today: Dr. Pete Sexton and Bradley Rops from Southeast Research Farm. Pete manages the farm, and then Brad helps in the farm. Uh, as an operations manager. So Pete and Brad, I don't know who is going first, but please feel free to chime in and introduce yourself and go ahead with your presentation. But I would like to make a quick note here. We don't have CCA credits, or we haven't gotten any QR code or approval or denial of any sort from the board yet. So I would suggest everyone who needs CCA credits to self-report, and then if you need any kind of justification to show that you're here, maybe take a quick picture of Pete and Brad's first and the last slide, and then I'll say the same thing after the first presentation and before the second one starts. Go ahead, Pete, and thanks for helping us with the webinar.
Okay, glad to help out, David. As David mentioned, I'm the supervisor at the Southeast Farm. Brad is operations manager. Work together and do in a number of projects. And so we're going to start talking about grazing, and variety work will follow. So Brad's going to lead the way here and discuss some grazing trials and grazing aspects of forages. And then I'll follow that with a discussion of rye and different variety trials we've done over the last few years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brad. And can you do the screen share deal, Brad?
Okay. Start with, this is our crew from the Southeast Research Farm. Got Pete Sexton, the farm manager, on the left. We've got a couple of recently retired people, and Gerald Williamson, ag technician, and Ruth Stevens, senior secretary, who have just both recently retired after over 40 years of work here. I'm in the center, serve as operations manager. We have Scott Bird, who is the livestock manager. Jocelyn Fausert, who is a research assistant, and she works with a lot of the agronomy and horticulture trials that we have going on. And then Addison Bransrud, who is a summer technician who has been here for a few years and helps with maintenance and assists with research trials. Okay, so today we're going to be talking forages, and I'm going to talk about largely the grazing side, and then Pete's going to follow up and speak more to the agronomics of things. And so we'll start here with rye, a very popular cover crop to use. And here we've got a picture of cow-calf pairs that are grazing rye in the spring. And when you are doing spring grazing, you certainly you want to start grazing early. Rye is a crop that really picks up speed in a hurry, and Pete will have some numbers for you later. But when it starts to green up, and as soon as temperatures start to warm up, it will start to joint and head out before you know it. So you want to get out there when that rye is just 4 to 6 inches tall, so you can take advantage of the lush growth and the high forage quality that is available, and try to get ahead of it, because if you wait too long, the rye is going to get ahead of your cattle, and palatability is going to drop, and cattle preference is going to decrease. So that's the key, I think, to grazing rye in the spring, is to make sure you start early. And then how long you leave them out there is going to be a balancing act. I think as rye grows and you progress into later spring, it starts to use a lot of water. So you need to balance your need for forage at the moment. And then you need to also look at what your following crop is going to be, and the water needs for that next crop. So if it's a wet spring, not a problem. Leave that rye out there and graze it as long as you can. It's going to use water and keep your ground trafficable for a following crop. If it's dry weather, then you need to maybe consider how important the current grazing is with your follow-up crop and possibly terminate early if conditions are dry so you can conserve water for whatever you're going to follow that rye cover crop with. Another cover crop option or a grazing option is to do some cool season crops and early spring grazing or late spring, early summer. And here we've got oats and peas being grazed in, well, this would be well into June with headed out oats. And, oats is probably one of the best spring cereals as far as putting on a lot of growth and tonnage. And then peas in there as a legume will add to the protein content. What we have found with grazing, a cereal grain in the spring is that if we go to strip grazing, which you'd see here, you can double your usable forage. So double the cattle or double the days you can get off of it. When we strip graze, there's less trampling and we have more utilization of the forage. So, if you turn them out into a large paddock, and especially as the crop matures, there is, you got a lot of trampling, and then you've got, contamination with urine and feces, and the cattle will refuse to come back and eat that. So if really the more frequent you can move the fence, the more forage utilization you're going to get. So, every 2 or 3 days or even daily or twice a day is going to increase the amount of forage that you're going to be able to get from grazing. Another option is to use warm season cover crops. Typically, this could follow a annual forage, or it could follow rye grazing in the spring or a cool season, or follow a small grain crop where you've planted into stubble. Warm season crops like millets, sorghum Sudan hybrids, cowpeas would be a broadleaf type that does really well in hot, dry weather. You get a lot of growth from these crops without a lot of water, so they're really good in droughty conditions, and they really tolerate or thrive on the heat, actually. So you don't want to plant these too early. You want to wait until soil temperatures, get up to 60 degrees before you put them in. When you're grazing warm season cover crops, and especially if you've got, sorghum Sudan hybrids that you're grazing, you want to be careful as we approach fall, or if we get into a drought situation. And then you get a sudden rain, you want to be careful of nitrates if they get flushed out with a rain following an extended drought. And you might want to test for that or pull cattle off periodically. Prussic acid poisoning is something that we're concerned with in the fall. And after a freeze or a frost, if you're grazing, visited with some people, if you're grazing tall plants like this, prussic acid probably isn't a great concern. But if you've grazed it down and you're bringing the cattle back through for regrowth, that's where you're going to have the highest concentrations of prussic acid. Your crop mix is also going to be something to consider. If you're grazing a complete or a uniform stand of sorghum Sudan, you're going to have more issues than if it's part of a blend. So that's where crop diversity will help, because that's going to dilute any issues you might have. Here we've got a picture of cattle grazing a cool season cover crop in the fall. This was following a small grain field. And we did a trial here, I think it was about 2014, Dr. Sexton and Dr. Elaine Grings. And it looked at following oats we had two fields, oats and rye, that were harvested for grain. And then in that stubble, we put two different cover crop blends. One was heavy on broadleaves, 75% broadleaves that were made up of radish, pea, lentil, and flax. The other was a higher grass blend that had a higher percentage of sorghum Sudan and oat in the mix. The objectives of the trial were to look at cattle gain and then also look at the yield of the next crop, which happened to be corn. And this isn't the exact plot, but it would show you, on the left side, we've got a cover crop that's got a lot of grasses in it. You can see this is after a frost, so the sorghum Sudan or the millets that would have been out there have frozen out, but we still have the green and lush cereal crops, the oats, and the brassicas that are in there are still green and thriving. And then on the right side, we've got a cover crop that is largely broadleaf plants and brassicas. So that's kind of the mixes we were looking at. Here's actually a graph that shows on the left side, we've got the average daily gain of the calves that were out there. And then we've got the different cover crop mixes and then the ground that they were on. So the first bar is on rye stubble and a broadleaf mix. Then we've got oat stubble and a broadleaf mix, rye and a grass cover crop mix, and oat and a grass type cover crop mix. And at the top here is percent grass in each one. Now we did have quite a bit of volunteer growth, especially in the oat fields. So you can see that, we still had a high percentage of grass in that mix, even though it was seeded as 75% broadleaves. And but you'll see as we increase the grass going across these different fields and mixes, that average daily gain goes up. Now our brassicas and such, the cattle like them. They're high in protein, so they have high feed value, but they do not have much fiber. And so the cattle get very loose on a diet that's a high percentage of those broadleaf types. And there's just not enough fiber. They can't take in enough total nutrients to put on a lot of gain. So if you're doing cover crops and if you're doing some grazing and gain and cattle performance is a priority for you, you want to make sure you put enough grass type products into that cover crop so that you get adequate performance and gain. This would be looking at the following corn crop after this particular trial. And you'll see that the corn favored the broadleaf blend over the grass blend. We got about 180 to 100 versus 165 bushel there. So that was a significant difference. Whether we had some exclusion blocks where we didn't have cattle. And so where we had the cattle grazing versus not grazing, there was no significant difference there. So the grazing of the cover crop did not impact the following corn crop in a negative way. In fact, it was, numerically slightly higher. And then we did look at fertilizer following that. So we had no fertilizer and we had 160 pounds in. And of course, cattle being out there will recycle nutrients, but it does not take the place of or fully. So you're gonna have to soil test and come back and provide nutrients there. We did another similar trial with Colin Tobin, graduate student here in 2016. And we had, equal blend, broadleaf, and grass blends versus control plots. This was a very wet year. The crop was not planted until June the following year. But corn yield, you'll see for all the cover crop blends was better than the control, which had no cover crop. And probably due to that cover crop utilizing moisture and having a better seed bed to plant into with the corn crop. And then as we look at, grazed versus ungrazed, There was no significant difference again in the following corn yield. We had 106 for those grazed plots, 102 for the no grazing. So again, grazing was not a detriment to the following crop. Something interesting here was we have nitrogen applied at the blue bars and no fertilizer in the yellow. You'll see where there was ungrazed plots, there was more of a difference in nitrogen response versus the grazed ones. So the cattle were contributing the feces, urine, recycling of nutrients did help in regard to fertility on that following crop. Oh, we did some grazing work with rye in the spring and in the fall and in the spring, and looked at following soybean yield. And I think Pete's going to present some of this data here later, but we'll just briefly say that when we grazed in fall and spring or spring only, and then followed rye with soybeans, it did not negatively impact the following crop. So grazing is a good strategy to use. Here's another trial where we followed a cover crop or an annual forage crop with soybeans. We had rye cut for silage, and then we turned around and planted soybeans in, and we did a number of different maturities from a 1.8 to a 2.8, and they were all around 60 bushel per acre yield following that crop. And we also had a block of forage sorghum that we put in following the rye, and that in that particular year yielded over 18 tons per acre forage yield. Good moisture year. Again, Pete will talk also about water use and how that's going to impact things. This is a field of hybrid rye that we raised for grain. We put cattle out here in the fall and grazed it down to pretty much nothing. And then we had some plots where we fenced the cattle off and did not let them graze. And then in December, we did biomass clippings, and we had 1,530 pounds of biomass in December on the ungrazed blocks and 360 pounds in the grazed blocks. So the cattle took off about 1,200 pounds per acre on these plots. And then the next year we let this go and we harvested, and this on the left side would have been the grazed grain, and on the right the ungrazed, and you can see the yields were identical. So fall grazing of rye raised for a cereal crop is not negatively impacted by grazing. And then we've done a little bit of work here with grazing corn. Corn can be used as a cover crop. And I think if you are using it following prevent planting or whatever, you need to check the rules because you might not be eligible for disaster payments with using corn. But we did some work here. We just devoted some corn to cattle grazing. We set this plot out in a grid type pattern, and we used different levels or maturities of corn so that we'd have kind of that corn in a more vegetative state as we progressed. So we had a block of corn that was 87-day maturity. Then we went to a 97-day, 103, and a 119. And we used fencing and kind of strip grazing or block grazing to take the cattle through. Here you can see a grazed portion and a block that we've got yet, and we just use step-in posts and poly wire, which the cattle largely respected. We did leave alleys in between so that it was easier to run the fence through. You could also plant straight and just use something to run the corn down and then come through and put your fencing in. You can see the alley's got a little weedy here on us. So this would be a picture of stubble on the right-hand side would have been one of the first blocks grazed, and then on the left, second block grazed. We started grazing at about blister stage on the corn. And then as we progressed through, we were kind of, in that blister to milk stage all the way through. The earlier you start, the more utilization of the whole plant you're going to have by the cattle. And then as the corn matures, you're going to have more stalk left over and less utilization. So here'd be a picture of the corn where the cattle have taken a bite off. You can see we're in milk stage there. So we started on July 27. We went through September. Second column there shows the corn maturity, and the third column, the number of days we had cattle in there. We were utilizing 20 yearling heifers here, replacement type heifers. And then, with the acreage that we had them turned into and the number of days, we had, 200 to 300 or more head days per acre. So if you figure out the number of cattle you can feed or the days you can feed them on corn, there's a lot of forage there, high quality forage. You've got some grain as well. And we had no problem putting on well over 3.5 pounds of gain on this type of a system. If you're looking at grazing corn, I would start grazing, at blister or very early milk stage. Let the cattle will utilize more of the plant earlier in the growth stage. And if you start them out there early, they're going to adapt to the grain as it matures. So as it starts to set starch, the cattle can slowly adapt to that versus turning them out in a field of fully developed corn. Planting a progression of maturities will allow you to utilize that over a longer period of time. You have an option to skip rows for easier fencing, but not necessary. Corn grazing can help fill in that late summer void if you largely have cool season pastures, and those kind of go dormant in the summertime. That corn can help fill that void until those cool season grasses start to green up again in the fall. So corn is usable as a cover crop, but like I said, check with your farm program or disaster payments and such. If you're relying on some payments there, you need to make sure you're following the rules before you utilize corn. In dry years, any grasses, nitrates is going to be a concern. So you'd want to potentially test for that. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Pete and let him go on from here.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Any cautions or risks there as far as grazing corn with too much grain in the diet that person needs to think about?
If you start early enough, I don't think there's any issues. Turning cattle out that aren't used to grain onto a well-developed grain field, you could have some acidosis problems and getting too much grain. So it depends what the prior diet is, and it depends on how early they start grazing the corn. So I will stop sharing, Pete, and then let you take over screen share.
I think there was a question there in the chat. Your fields look weed free. Can you comment more on weed control? Thanks. You do have to think about your herbicides that you use for grazing. I think in that case, we had an early application of atrazine, and I think Callisto, I think it had a 45-day grazing restriction. So that went on in early June, I want to say. And so, you know, by mid to late July, we were clear to graze. But you do have to think about, you know, herbicide and your grazing restrictions. Lately, we've gone to using tolpyrolate, which is trade name is Shieldex, and that has a shorter grazing restriction according to my memory. But you do want to check the label, and you want to be careful about your herbicides when you're going to graze corn. The other thing I would mention, and feel free to correct me here, Brad, if I got it wrong, but the cattle here were in small blocks, so they weren't like turned out into a large field of corn. So they had to they couldn't just select the ears. So Brad put them out, and then when they grazed everything down, then he opened up another block for them.
Yes, they were block grazed. So just a few days at a time, 3 to 5 days at a time.
Yeah. So they were ended up, you know, they were forced to eat the forage, the husks and the leaves as well as the grain. Okay. I think we'll kind of change gears here. I'm going to talk about a lot of variety trial work. And then we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end. This graph shows some variety trial plots with the winter annual forages in early April. And I'm showing it to point out the difference between rye and triticale and wheat. This first plot at the top is wheat, and then triticale, and then rye. And you can see the rye's greened up quite a bit earlier than the triticale or the wheat. And this is really consistent. We've run winter annual variety trials for forage production for probably 5-6 years anyway. And in years when we have kind of a tough winter, the rye is really head and shoulders better than wheat or triticale for forage production. It puts on growth faster in the faster in the spring, and handles winter injury better than wheat or triticale do. When we have a really nice winter that's favorable, the triticale might keep up with the rye. But in a difficult winter, the rye is definitely more resilient. And you can see that here in this picture. Let me see here. So now I'm going to go through a number of tables with a lot of data. And so it's more data than we really want to look at. So I want to direct your attention to the top of the table. Can you see my cursor there, Brad? Does that show up? Or
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
okay, all right. So it can just kind of follow the cursor. So we're looking at winter annual forages, and this is Hazlitt's open pollinated line. 2019, it was our best yielder. In 2020, it was second numerically, and statistically, it was close to the top. Next slide, this is 2021. Again, Hazlitt is statistically similar to our other varieties in the trial. The Progress and Daniela are hybrid rye. They're about twice the cost of the open pollinated rye. 2022, again, Hazlitt is close to the top, and it's statistically similar to our best hybrid lines. And this is 2024 trial from Wagner, and Hazlitt again was our in this case was numerically the top yielding line, and it performed as well as the hybrid lines. So the point here trying to bring out is that Hazlitt has been a consistent performer for us. If you're looking for tonnage from rye as a forage crop, and economically it might cost, you know, I'm just, you have to talk with your seed dealer, but I think it's going to be on the order of $15, $12 to $15 a bushel. If you planted at 2 bushels an acre, you're looking at you know, $25, $30 an acre. If you plant the hybrid rye, it's going to be more like $60, $65 an acre for the seed. And production wise, the Hazlet has performed pretty consistently over the years. It's generally always among the top yielding lines, if not the top yielding line. So when we're thinking about rye as a forage crop, then we have to think about water use and rapid growth in the spring. And Brad mentioned this, and I'm just pointing out a time series graph here. So this is rye biomass versus a date of the burn down based when it was terminated. And this is from Ben Brockmuller's master's thesis, which he did here at the Southeast Farm. And I'd like to point out here in late April, we're running about 300 pounds per acre biomass. And we come here at the end of May, we're a little over 2,500 pounds of biomass per acre. So we have about an 8-fold increase in rye biomass in the month of May. It just takes off like a rocket. And that has to do, you have to think about that in terms of forage quality, because as you get past the boot stage, the forage quality drops very quickly. This is some data out of Wisconsin. We're looking at relative forage quality versus days after boot stage. And the rye loses its quality quickly once it starts to head out. And so this is kind of why Brad was saying to start early, because it takes off fast. And when you get out here, it's going to lose quality very fast. It's going to become very stemmy and low quality feed. Second thing to point out with this is, well, it's growing very rapidly. It's also using water rapidly. So this is some data out of Minnesota. We're looking at fallow, which is the black line, versus where there's a rye cover crop. And on this axis, we've got soil water. So this is from Morris, Minnesota. This is from St. Paul, Minnesota. And I'd like to point out here that you don't really have a lot of separation between where you had rye and where you didn't until you get into early May. You get into early May, you start to get a lot of growth on the rye, which we pointed out in the earlier graphs. And by the time we get out to June, we're looking at a difference of over 2 inches of soil moisture loss at both sites. So the rye is going to grow very fast in May, and it's going to use a lot of water. So you have to think about it. If you kind of just planted the rye as a cover crop and you like what you see and you're keeping it around because it looks good, but you don't really need the forage. If you're in a wet year, you can let her rip, and you know you'll get the moisture and kind of have your cake and eat it too. If you're in a dry year, it's going to use 2 inches of moisture that your next crop may need, and your next crop may suffer in a dry year. So in that case, you want to think about killing it back here in early May, end of April, early May. And that has 2 advantages for you. One, it's not going to be using this moisture in May. Second thing is, when you kill it when it's young like that, it's going to have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, and it's going to turn over quickly. So if you kill it when it gets older, it's going to have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's going to have more fiber, and so it's going to have used moisture, and also it's going to have more nutrients in the straw in the top. And especially you kind of want to think about that with potassium. This is some data. I just did some textbook values, and we're looking at NPKs versus a ton of corn silage versus a ton of rye silage. And rye has about twice as much potassium per ton as corn does. So it extracts more potassium than corn would, and in a marginal situation, you're pulling, if you're cutting it for silage, you're removing that from the field. So now it's used moisture and it's used potassium. And if you go into a drought, you need both of those because potassium availability is really important in dry conditions. So you want to think about that, be cognizant of it. If you're going to cut the rye for silage, be aware that you're going to be pulling a lot of potassium out of the ground too. If you're grazing it, then those nutrients are basically staying in the field and it's not such an issue. The other thing is with rye silage, if you're doing this with dairy cattle, you want to think about milk fever. And I'm not a ruminant nutritionist, so you be better advised to talk to someone who is a ruminant nutritionist. But I think when you get high potassium levels, you're more prone to have milk fever problems. So just if you're aware of it, you can avoid it. Okay, now we're going to look at some data from different years, wet years and dry years following rye. And this is from a wetter year, 2017. Brad alluded to this earlier. We ran a number of different maturity groups. This is 2.5, 2.8, 1.8, 2.2 maturity beans. We didn't see a difference in the wet year between the maturities. We got 60 bushel an acre beans, which was consistent with our farm average that year. So this was a year we could have our cake and eat it too. We got silage, we got rain, we got good soybean crop. And as Brad mentioned, if we'd put sorghum in, because we did some sorghum check plots, we got about 18 tons per acre sorghum silage as an alternative. So this is a scenario in a wet year, good moisture, and we had good production following that rye silage. Okay, this is a dry year, 2021. I'm not sure if we can get to the bottom of this slide or not. Well, oh, I did it. Here, let me go back. Okay. Well, okay. Can't quite see the bottom of the slide, but that's the way it is. We'll make the best of it. In this situation with soybeans following rye silage, we had 29.3 bushel per acre yield at the end of the year. And our nearby checks, we got over 60 bushel an acre. So the rye used the moisture. The beans struggled to get started because we had a hot, dry June, and we got half a soybean crop in that scenario. If you look a little further down, we've got early corn, 73 bushel an acre, where it followed rye silage, 158 bushel an acre where it was a nearby check. So we got basically cut our soybean and corn yields in half where we had the rye silage, and it was because of the moisture that it used early. In this case, we had some sorghum check plots also, and we got 16 tons an acre of forage sorghum. So the forage sorghum handled the drought better. And I apologize, the formatting on these slides kind of shifted when going to an online format. So they kind of, we lost a little bit at the bottom of it. Okay. This is, oh, that's the last one. Okay. This is the next year, 2022. Again, we kind of got a deal where the formatting moved the tables around a little bit on us. But the take-home message here, if we can look at this, is we had forage sorghum in a very dry year. We got 13 tons an acre. Corn silage, we only got 8 tons an acre. Soybean, where we had an early soybean, we got 20 bushel an acre. The farm average that year was a little over 30, and we were looking at a terminal drought. So the early beans matured before the drought got worse, and so we lost we lost about 12 bushel an acre because of the rye silage. Late soybeans, we didn't Brad didn't even combine them entirely. We got less than 5 bushel an acre. So, and of course 2022 for us was a very severe drought. So the take home message I'm trying to get across here is, in a wet year with rye silage, you can have your cake and eat it too if you manage it well. And you can pick up a nice soybean crop following the rye. In a dry year, the soybean crop can get hammered, and you might think about going to, if you find yourself in that situation or drought is developing, you might think about going to a forage sorghum or sorghum rather than soybeans as a follow-up crop. We haven't had any trouble getting forage sorghum established in the rye. Some people have, but we kill the rye pretty quickly after we chop it if we're doing that. So think about your decision point there in late April, early May. Do I want to keep this rye for forage? How important is it to me? Especially if you're going to cut it for silage and you're going into a drought situation, your next crop may get hammered. If you're grazing it, it's a little more forgiving, because when you graze it, you leave more residue on the surface. And, you don't remove all the nutrients, you don't remove all the covers, you don't have all the water loss that you do when you cut for silage and you just got bare ground. So there's one decision point there, late April, early May. And if the forage isn't that important to you and it looks like a drought's developing, then you want to just spray it out then. Your other point of decision is, if you cut it for silage, do you want to follow it with the soybean crop, or do you want to follow it with some kind of a warm season forage mix that's more drought tolerant? Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about oats and spring seeded forages, variety trials we've done with that. And then we'll talk about summer warm season forages, and then end up with fall seeded forages. And so we're going to talk about variety trial work with each of those. So we're looking at cool seasons. This would be early spring planted forages. Again, there's a lot of data here. I just want to point out all our combinations that did the best here had oats in them. And then next is barley. Spring triticale and the brassicas didn't produce as much tonnage as oats and barley. So this is from 2018. This is 2019. This mix isn't labeled here, but this has oats in it. And again, all our better materials tend to be with oats as the main source of dry matter, or barley. 2020, these mixes have oats in them. So again, our our best production dry matter wise is coming with oats, and barley's performing close to the top. So just to go back here for a second, the brassicas and don't tend to produce as much dry matter per acre, although they're high quality forages. We've used spring seeded winter rye a couple times, winter triticale and winter rye, and we just haven't had that good of luck with it as a forage when it's seeded in the spring. So the idea was, well, maybe we'll seed the winter rye, in early April, and it'll stool out, and we'll see what we get for tonnage. And that hasn't been a winner for us the years we've tried it. So the winter rye, the Hazlitt rye, is great. You plant it in the fall and it vernalizes, it comes on really strong. But if you plant it the same line in early April or mid-April, you don't see that strong production from it. Better off to plant oats or barley if you're planting in the spring. Okay, so we're looking at warm seasons. So now we're looking at June, July planting. Again, a lot of variety trial data. I won't try to go through all of it, but our forage sorghums and sorghum Sudans tend to be the best performers tonnage-wise in that situation. So the millets can do okay, but they don't keep up with the sorghums and the sorghum Sudan grasses. This is looking at TDN per acre. Again, our forage sorghums and sorghum Sudans tend to be at the top of the list there. This is 2022. Again, the forage sorghum Sudans perform pretty well. We have some materials with brassicas. They really don't, the brassicas don't do so well in the hot weather. We did some work here where we looked at preference. So the plots, we had plots that were sampled and then for biomass, and then the cattle turned out onto it, and then about 4 days later, Brad and the crew came back and took more samples to get an estimate of how much biomass disappeared from the plots. And you can see there's a fair bit of variability between the lines. They didn't tend to like the brassicas in this case, and the Piper Sudan grass looked good, but it didn't really, the cattle didn't seem to like it. I don't know, Brad, do you have any comments on that?
I think the stems, although it's fine stemmed, the stems are woodier or tougher and not as succulent. So I think that's why they avoided that.
Okay. This is from last year's forage trial. Again, we got Sudan grasses and forage sorghums tend to top the list for production. The floor matting stretched this out a bit, but you can see our top yielders are all forage sorghum Sudans. And as Brad mentioned, one thing with those is prussic acid is an issue if you have a lot of drought stress. Also nitrates can be an issue. I've talked a little bit with our previous forage agronomist, Vance Owens, and also with Kevin Sedovic from NDSU. And they both mentioned to me that it's the prussic acid thing is it doesn't happen very often, and if you keep the your sorghum Sudans at maybe 25% of the blend, they think the risk is quite low. So I think you'd want to be, if you're in a marginal situation with a lot of drought, or and you probably might want to test it. But if you can keep the percentage of the stand that's forage sorghum or sorghum Sudan, less than 30%, the cattle will kind of self-select where they want to go, and they don't see problems with it in that situation. Okay, so always good to test though, and be careful. All right, so here we go. We're looking at this so going through the year, we started with the winter annuals, spring, summer. Now we're looking at seeding in mid-August and what's the best performers are there. So you can see these cattle are grazing a cover crop. You can see mature corn in the background. So we're looking at October grazing of a cover crop that's planted in maybe early August. And how do things look? So we ran a trial with this a few years ago. And you can see the cool seasons, barley and oats, brassicas did well going into a fall with this is mid-August planting date. and our sorghum Sudans and cowpeas that did so well, and forage sorghums that did well, with the warm planting in June or July, weren't the top producers here because they got killed by frost. And so in this situation, you probably want to go in again with a blend and weight your blend towards these barley and oats. I like oats quite a bit in general, especially in the spring. If we have wet conditions, they can pick up a lot of crown rust in the fall, especially if you've got oat stubble around the farm. So even in the situation where we're planting in the fall, I like to mix oats with barley because the strains of crown rust that attack oats are don't bother barley very much. So my suggestion would be to include barley in your cover crop blend along with the oats, and then I favor that as a high percentage of the mix if you're going to graze it in October, November, because they'll survive a frost and they'll keep growing and they'll put on the tonnage for you. These warm season ones, you might want to keep those a small percentage of the mix, both so you don't have prussic acid to deal with, and also because they're going to freeze out and die anyway and not produce much. So this is a time to probably avoid the forage sorghums with this later planting. So my interpretation of that data, I look at oats as a workhorse forage in cool conditions. Barley does very well. Barley has a little lower base temperature than oats, so it'll come on a little faster with very early planting, cold conditions. We've had red clover, sweet clover, and ryegrass underseeded in those. And if you have good moisture, you'll get some regrowth out of it. If you don't, they won't do much as a follow-up crop. The forage sorghum Sudans, and for the warm season, we're talking June, July planting, we're top yielders. But you do have to be cognizant of the prussic acid deal, and you use a blend to reduce risk, and if in doubt, test. Then winter annual forages, rye looks is the most resilient choice because it handles winter stress so well, and comes on strong fast in the spring, quicker than your other forages. But it is a little lower in terms of quality, but the overall production and rate of production is higher with rye than wheat or triticale. As Brad mentioned, you want to get on it early because it does grow fast. Quality drops off very quickly after the boot stage. And you want to think about water use, and that's just going to depend on your situation, the need you have for the forage, what you've got for reserve moisture in the soil, and what the forecast looks like. And so everybody's in a little different situation, every year with that. Some years we're in a wet spring, sometimes we're in a dry spring. This year, we don't have much reserve moisture here in Beersford. And so if we don't need to forage and we have a rye cover crop, we're going to spray it out early. But other years we'd let her rip if we had plenty of moisture. And then also it depends on your relative need for forage. So that's a situation nobody can really tell you what you should do. You just have to think through it for yourself, but be aware it's going to use moisture, well over 2 inches of moisture if you let it go through to the end of May. We started doing some work this year with corn sorghum intercropping for silage. We like the idea. It's an old idea that we're kind of bringing back, working on, testing out, I should say. I don't want to say we're bringing it back because maybe we'll find something we don't like with it, but at this point it looks good. We ran a trial this last year with a 50-50 corn sorghum and a 25-75, so mostly sorghum blend. We got better silage yield with the high blend of the sorghum, and we're gonna, if we look at it in terms of cost of production for the silage, having more sorghum, 3/4 sorghum blend is going to be lower seed cost, and we'll save money on nitrogen also. It also widens the window for cutting silage because it's higher moisture. So if we can let the corn go a little longer, so the corn can put on a little more starch in the grain and still have enough moisture to make good silage, because the sorghum was moisture content will stay up there. So we're hoping that works good. Warren, Rushi, and Zach, and Brad and Scott are going to run a feedlot trial here this spring and compare these. We grew about 8 acres of each of these: corn sorghum, 50/50 and 25/75. So we've got a good amount of silage from each of them, and we're going to feed that out and see how the cattle perform and translate this into cost of gain for the cattle. But I think at this point we're going to see lower cost of gain where we use the corn sorghum intercrop versus 100% corn. But that's a work in progress. The feedlot part of this will start here in the next month, and this time next year, God willing, we'll have some data on that. So that wraps up our talk. Any questions for Brad or myself?
Hi, Pete. Thank you for the presentation. There's one question about 2019 production year. Your mid-August planting study was in 2019, an exceptionally wet year. Do you have any forage recommendation for a moderate to moderate moisture year?
Okay. I would say my recommendation there would be, if you're following with corn, in our situation, the trials we've run, corn doesn't follow winter rye very well. And so if I was going to plant corn as the next crop, I would use a cover crop blend where everything's going to winter kill. And I would probably go, 30% oats, 30% barley, maybe 15% millet, so I don't have to think about prussic acid, and then maybe go 25% brassicas and peas. That would be my mix if we were going to graze it in the fall and go to corn. If we were going to soybeans as the following crop, soybeans tolerate winter rye very well. And in that case, I would put maybe 35%, maybe 25, 30 pounds per acre, 25 pounds per acre of winter rye in the blend, and cut back on the oats and barley. And then you graze that in the fall, and then you might, if depending on the next year, you might be able to come back and graze it again in the spring if you've got moisture, and then plant beans into it. That would be my recommendation. So if you're going to beans, I would risk it myself. I'd put a good charge of winter rye in the blend. And then, like Brad mentioned and we talked about, if it looks dry next spring, then you want to kill that early. If you got good moisture, you can let her go, and then you can kind of balance that versus your need for the forage. But I would put winter rye in the blend if I was following it with soybeans.
Thank you, Pete. There's one more question that came up when you were answering the first one. Can you comment on soil health and the value of working the forage back into the soil?
Okay, so these cover the whole annual forage program, with whether you're using millets, sorghum Sudans, or not a heavy dose of forage sorghum in warm season, or you're going with oat peas in the beginning, and in any of those scenarios, you're introducing a change in the rotation, which is healthy for the soil. And it's the diversity helps with your soil health, helps decrease pest issues. And so if you can replace a year of a grain crop, if you have the circumstances to use annual forages, that's good for your overall system. I like the winter rye in as a cover crop and as a forage because it also, I think, helps with compaction. And I don't have a lot of data on that, so I'm just sharing my own personal opinion there. But I think if we get the winter rye there, it grows really quickly in the spring. Typically, you've got very high moisture conditions, so there's not a lot of physical resistance in the soil to root growth. And so even if the soil's compacted, the rye can send roots through it because you got good moisture. And then when you plant into that, you've got a nice root network that your grain crop can follow. So there's also kind of a biotillage thing I think you can pick up with the winter rye. And I think it's helped us in some situations where we had heavy fall traffic. And we've gone back in with a winter rye cover crop. And over time, I think we've ameliorated those problems. I don't know, Brad, you got any reflections there? Or?
No, I think, yeah, just diversity, extended rotations, all have positive benefits. So you can take the corn and the soybeans and extend the years between those. You're going to alleviate pest pressures, weeds, insects, diseases, and if you've got livestock or access to livestock, or neighbors to livestock. With the price of cattle now, putting on weight is a prosperous thing. So I'm sure it's easy to put up fence in a hurry and rent some acres out to a neighbor that's got the livestock, bring them in and do some custom grazing. Recycles that nutrients and puts it back out there. I think, yeah, the silage deal where we do silage, we always come back with cover crops because we're taking biomass and plant material off the ground, and we want to get a cover crop back out there so that we not only have the soil covered, but we're keeping a living root out there for as long as we can, and we're putting carbon back onto the ground.
One more question. What about nitrogen in the soil to reduce fertilizer cost? I believe that's from the forage or cover crops. Yep.
Yeah. We haven't done a lot of research on that, David. Basically, the bit that we've done with as a cover crop is that when we have good moisture, we see a yield benefit, but we don't see a nitrogen reduction when we use a broadleaf cover crop mix with brassicas and peas primarily as a cover crop. And then of course, if we have a dry year, then we can have a negative impact if it used moisture, if we go into a severe drought. I think over time, if we keep going, we might see our soil health improve enough that we can cut back on the nitrogen rates. And we haven't quantified that. And the times we were doing those trials, well, we ran quite a few trials on that, probably 5-10 years ago. And at that point, we were just recently transitioned to no-till. And so we didn't see the savings at that point. So my advice would be, if you're just switching to a no-till scenario, I wouldn't cut back on the nitrogen. If you've been no-tilling for quite a while and your soils you think are pretty healthy, then I would test it on a smaller scale and put out some test strips and just kind of take it a bit at a time, and see if you can cut back your nitrogen rates and keep your yields up. But I don't have a solid database answer where I can say, you know, after 10 years you can cut back your nitrogen rate by 20 pounds an acre. I guess we should maybe try to develop that and do that kind of research. But I don't have those numbers. But when we did try it, we didn't see a benefit, but that was recently transitioned ground.
I think this has already been answered, but I'm gonna read it off to you anyway. So, did you till or did you no till the forest sorghum into rice stubble?
We no-till.
I think that puts us through all of the chats and questions. I mean, you can still do a couple of moments to do that. Otherwise, we're past quite a few minutes past the hour. And when you are doing this poll, evaluation poll, I would like to mention one more time that unfortunately we didn't receive any CCA credit QR codes for this week. All 6 presentations, we're not able to provide that, and we really apologize for that. But you are free to self-report to the board, and then and you had all 6 presentations this week. You know, today was, you know, a couple of presentations for forages, but the last 4 in 2 previous days were for crop production, crop management. So feel free to do that. And you know, and unfortunately we couldn't get the QR codes in time for this week.